everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. You guys sent in some really interesting stuff this week, and I'm excited to jump into it with you.
Absolutely. Should be a fascinating one.
We're talking Ukraine, Europe, the U.S., a whole lot of moving pieces there.
Yeah, a real geopolitical puzzle.
Well, the centerpiece for this duck dive is this DW News video titled, "Can Europe Welcome Zelenskyy at Ukraine Summit Without Enraging Trump?" DW News. So right off the bat, we're dealing with some tricky dynamics.
Oh, yeah, that title alone tells you there's a lot to unpack.
Totally. And it's not just about the politics. We're going to hear from experts and the Ukrainian politicians themselves to get a sense of how this whole triangle is being reshaped, the ongoing conflict, President Trump's, well, let's just say his unpredictable moves.
Yeah, unpredictable is one way to put it. I think this whole situation really highlights the tightrope that European leaders are walking right now.
It's like watching a high wire act, right?
Yeah.
They want to support Ukraine, but they also don't want to poke the bear, so to speak, when it comes to the U.S.
Exactly. And Zelensky's recent trips really put this dilemma into sharp focus. On the one hand, you have him being greeted with open arms in the UK. I mean, Prime Minister Starmer practically rolled out the red carpet. Unwavering support, huge crowds cheering Zelenskyy on in the streets of London. It was a powerful display of solidarity.
Oh, yeah, those images were striking. A real show of force, you could say. And then you cut to that Oval Office meeting with President Trump.
Oh, man, you could practically feel the tension through the screen, right?
Yeah.
Just the body language alone spoke volumes.
Seriously, like you didn't need a translator to understand that things weren't exactly cozy between those two.
It makes you wonder what Starmer's game is here. Is he trying to position himself as some kind of middleman, a bridge between the U.S. and Europe on the Ukraine issue? Because clearly those two sides aren't exactly seeing eye to eye right now.
Oh, that's interesting. Like he's anticipating a U.S. retreat from the region and trying to prepare for that.
It's possible. And you have to remember the timing here. Immediately after that tense White House meeting, European leaders came out with strong vocal support for Zelenskyy.
It was like they were sending a message. Or maybe even two messages.
Oh, I like that. Lay it on me.
Okay, so message one is to Zelenskyy and Ukraine. You're not alone in this. We've got your back. But then message two, maybe that's directed at President Trump. Like, hey, if you're going to pull back, we're willing to step up and fill the gap. What do you think?
I think you're spot on. It's a delicate balancing act, but they're definitely trying to send signals on multiple fronts. And then, of course, you have NATO lurking in the background. Where do they fit into all of this? I mean, they're supposed to be this big unified force for security, right?
Right. But even within NATO, we're seeing some cracks emerging. I'm thinking of that statement from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, basically urging Zelenskyy to mend fences with Trump.
Yeah, that didn't go over well with a lot of people.
It felt a little tone deaf, like he was prioritizing harmony within NATO over actually addressing Ukraine's very real security needs.
Yeah, like, hey, can we all just get along so we don't have to deal with this messy situation?
Exactly. But the question is, does Stoltenberg even speak for everyone in NATO? Because I seem to recall a lot of other NATO members being quite vocal in their support for Zelenskyy, even after that whole awkward White House meeting.
Right, and it's not just lip service either. They're putting real resources on the table, potentially increasing military and economic aid to Ukraine. So we have this interesting dynamic where some in NATO are urging appeasement, while others are preparing for a potential showdown.
Okay, so we've got Europe sending mixed signals, NATO trying to figure out its stance. But what about the view from Ukraine itself? What are they making of all this?
Well, DW's correspondent in Kiev, Nick Connolly, paints an interesting picture. He says there's this mix of surprise and cautious optimism in Ukraine.
Surprise, huh? What are they surprised about?
It seems like they weren't expecting Europe to be so forceful in their support, especially given the potential for backlash from the U.S. They thought they might be more on their own, so to speak.
So they're pleasantly surprised, but still cautious. I get it. It makes sense. And it's not just the politicians either, right?
Nope, not at all. Connolly points out that a lot of everyday Ukrainians believe that Zelenskyy had no choice but to stand up to Trump.
They think that giving in would have just emboldened him to push for even more concessions down the line. It's like, give him an inch and he'll take a mile kind of thing.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
They see it as a matter of principle, standing up for their sovereignty, their right to determine their own future.
Yeah, I can respect that. Even if it was risky, it seems like Zelensky's actions earned him a lot of respect, both domestically and on the world stage.
Absolutely. He showed that Ukraine isn't going to be pushed around, that they're willing to fight for their interests, even when facing a superpower like the U.S. And that brings us to a really crucial question. How much influence does the U.S. really have anymore, especially when it comes to Europe?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because if the U.S. is pulling back, does that create a vacuum for, say, Russia to step in?
Those are the big, scary questions that no one seems to have a clear answer to. And to delve a little deeper into the U.S.-Ukraine angle of all of this, let's turn to Gustav Grasel. He's a security expert from the Austrian National Defense Academy.
Okay, so he's got a front row seat to all this drama. What's his take?
Well, he's pretty blunt in his assessment. He argues that the U.S.-Ukraine relationship is severely damaged, like really, really damaged. And it goes way beyond just personality clashes or policy disagreements.
Oh, I remember reading some of this stuff. He doesn't pull any punches. Basically, he's saying that Trump is so fixated on making deals with Putin that he sees Ukraine as this minor inconvenience, like a bargaining chip to be used in his grand strategy.
Yeah, he practically accuses Trump of having this America First tunnel vision where everything else is just a side issue. There's even this sense from Gressel that there's a certain arrogance coming from Washington, like we're the big dogs, we call the shots, and you little guys just have to fall in line.
Not exactly a recipe for a healthy relationship. But do you think Zelensky's going to play along? I mean, he went into that White House meeting hoping to secure some concrete security guarantees from the U.S., right? Things like military aid, intelligence sharing, maybe even a clear commitment to defend Ukraine in case of a Russian attack.
That was definitely the hope going in, but based on Gressel's analysis, it seems like Zelensky left that meeting empty-handed. And not just empty-handed, but feeling like he got played. Like he was led on with promises that were never going to materialize.
Man, that's gotta sting. So, what's Gressel's prognosis? Is Ukraine doomed without U.S. support?
He's not quite that pessimistic. He does acknowledge that Ukraine could survive without direct U.S. military support. But, and this is a big BUT, it would come at a tremendous cost.
Okay, so we're talking potentially losing even more territory to Russia, facing devastating casualties, and basically being forced to accept a much weaker position in the region. Not exactly a rosy picture.
It's a bleak outlook, to say the least. But remember, this is just one expert's opinion. There are other perspectives out there, and we need to consider those as well.
Right, because ultimately it's up to Zelensky and the Ukrainian people to decide what risks they're willing to take, what sacrifices they're willing to make.
And to get a better understanding of how they might be weighing those options, let's hear directly from some key Ukrainian figures who were interviewed for this DW News piece. First up, we have Kira Rudik, a member of the Ukrainian parliament.
Okay, so she's right in the thick of things. What's her take?
Well, her reaction to the whole Trump-Zelensky exchange was a mix of shock and defiance. You can't really blame her, right?
Especially when you remember that Trump's big security guarantee was basically, don't worry, I'm sure Putin wants peace.
Right. Not exactly the most reassuring words, especially coming from a guy who's buddy-buddy with Putin.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's buying that. And then there's this whole idea of a minerals deal that's been floating around as a potential solution. Fill me in, what's the deal with this minerals deal?
Honestly, the details are still pretty murky.
Yeah.
The basic idea is that Ukraine would provide the U.S. with certain valuable minerals, and in return, well, it's not entirely clear what they would receive. Maybe some economic aid, maybe some vague promises of support. It's all very nebulous.
Sounds like a classic Trump move,
Yeah.
all flash and no substance. But what kind of minerals are we even talking about here, and why would they be so valuable to Trump?
Well, the reporting is a bit vague on that front, but it seems like they could be these rare earth minerals. Things like lithium, cobalt, manganese, the stuff that's essential for high-tech manufacturing, especially for things like batteries and electronics.
Ah, so this is where Trump's America First agenda comes in. He wants to reduce U.S. reliance on China for these critical materials. And wouldn't you know it, Ukraine happens to have some decent reserves?
Exactly. It's all about securing those supply chains, making America less dependent on its rivals. But here's the thing. Even if this deal does happen, it raises some serious ethical and economic concerns for Ukraine.
Like what?
Well, for starters, are they getting a fair price for these resources? What are the environmental impacts of mining them? And most importantly, is this just a short-term fix to appease Trump, or is it part of a larger strategy for Ukrainian economic independence?
So a lot of questions, not a lot of answers.
Right. And that seems to be Rudik's main point. She expresses serious doubts about whether this minerals deal would actually benefit Ukraine in the long run. And she's got a pretty powerful parting shot. European security rests on Europe's shoulders. It's almost like she's saying, okay, U.S., you're on your own. We got this.
Wow. That's a bold statement. Do you think she really means it? Can Europe actually go it alone? I mean, they've relied on the U.S. for security for so long.
It's a huge gamble, for sure. But it speaks to a growing sentiment in Europe, this sense that they can't rely on the U.S. to be the world's policeman anymore, especially with someone like Trump at the helm. They're realizing they need to take their destiny into their own hands. It's like we're witnessing a tectonic shift in global power dynamics.
And speaking of shifts, let's bring in another perspective. Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the former prime minister of Ukraine.
Oh yeah, he's a fascinating figure. A lot of history there.
Well, he offers a slightly different take on all of this. For starters, he's not interested in dwelling on the past. He acknowledges the drama, the tension, the whole Trump-Zelenskyy debacle, but his message is basically, let's focus on the future. What's done is done.
A very pragmatic approach.
Huh?
So what does he propose? What's his vision for the future?
Well, he starts by pointing at the obvious. The only one who really benefited from this whole mess was Putin.
Hard to argue with that assessment. Chaos and division are his bread and butter.
Exactly. So what's Yatsenyuk's solution? He throws out this intriguing idea, a joint EU and UK negotiating team being sent to Washington. Their mission, mend fences, rebuild trust, and develop a clear roadmap for the future.
So he's not writing off the U.S. entirely. He still sees value in dialogue and cooperation. But is he naive to think that's possible with the current administration?
Maybe, but he is pushing for a more unified strategic approach from Europe. He wants to see them acting as a more cohesive force, not just reacting to U.S. whims. And get this, he's actually open to that minerals deal we were talking about.
Really? I wouldn't have guessed that. Didn't Rudik express some serious skepticism about that whole thing?
She did. But Yatsenyuk sees it as a way to, as he puts it, appease Trump's base and potentially attract some much-needed investment to Ukraine.
It's like he's playing a game of chess, trying to figure out how to maneuver within Trump's unpredictable world.
That's exactly it. But here's the catch. He emphasizes that this minerals deal can't be the end game. It can't be a substitute for a real peace process, one that meets Ukraine's demands and adheres to international law.
So he's willing to play the game, but he's not willing to compromise on the fundamental principles.
Exactly. And that brings us to his final point, which I found really surprising. Despite everything we've just discussed, Yatsenyuk still believes in Euro-Atlantic unity. And get this, he still sees the U.S. as a vital leader in the free world.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. It's like he's holding these two seemingly contradictory ideas in his mind at the same time, acknowledging the damage that's been done, but still clinging to the hope that things could be repaired.
It really highlights the complexity of international relations, right? There are no easy answers, no black and white solutions. It's all about navigating shades of gray.
And that's where we come in, right? To try and make sense of all this grayness, to understand the different perspectives, the competing interests, the potential risks, any opportunities.
Exactly. And I think we've done a pretty good job of laying the groundwork here in part one. We've heard from Zelenskyy, we've heard from Ukrainian politicians, we've even gotten some expert analysis. But the story doesn't end there.
Oh no, not even close. Now we need to figure out what all of this means for Ukraine, for Europe, for the global balance of power. And that's exactly what we'll be doing in part two of this deep dive. Those Ukrainian voices we just heard, they really bring this whole situation to life, don't they? It's easy to get lost in the abstract, geopolitics, but hearing their hopes, their fears, makes it all very real.
Oh, for sure. It's like they're stuck in this impossible situation, right?
Yeah.
Needing support from these powerful allies, but also refusing to be anyone's pawn. It's inspiring, but also kind of terrifying, What happens if they push too far and end up isolated?
That's the gamble they're taking. But think about everything Ukraine has already endured, revolution war, political turmoil, and they're still fighting for their right to exist on their own terms.
There's a resilience there that's hard not to admire.
It reminds me of that old saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But let's be honest, stronger doesn't always mean safe. Yeah.
That's the harsh reality, and it's important to remember that we're not just talking about abstract concepts here. This is about real people, real lives being impacted by these decisions made in, distant capitals.
And that's why I think this deep dive is so important. It's not just about the what of the news, but the so what. How are these events shaping the lives of Ukrainians, and what does it mean for, the rest of the world? Precisely. And I think we're starting to see some pretty significant shifts in the global landscape, The U.S., which has long been seen as the guarantor of European security, they seem to be wavering in that role. They're less predictable, less reliable, maybe even less interested in playing world police.
And that creates this vacuum, this uncertainty that Europe is trying to figure out how to fill. We talked about those strong statements of support for Zelenskyy, the potential for increased aid, but let's be realistic, can Europe really step up to the plate?
That's the million-dollar question. Remember, Europe isn't some monolithic entity. It's a collection of countries with their own interests, their own internal politics, and different levels of commitment to this whole Ukraine situation.
Right. It's like herding cats sometimes.
Yeah.
And even if they can agree on a course of action, there are some serious practical challenges.
Absolutely. Increased support for Ukraine means potentially diverting resources from other priorities, making tough economic choices. And let's not forget about NATO. Can they maintain a united front on this, even with those internal disagreements we discussed earlier?
And if they can't, what does that mean for their credibility as a deterrent to Russian aggression? Does Putin see this as a sign of weakness, an opportunity to exploit? It's a bit like a giant game of Jenga, isn't it? One wrong move and the whole tower could come crashing down.
That's a great analogy. And I think that sense of precarity of things being on the brink, it's really palpable right now. It's no wonder there's so much focus on potential solutions, even if they're imperfect.
Speaking of which, let's circle back to that minerals deal. I'm still a bit fuzzy on the specifics. What kind of minerals are we talking about, and why would they be so valuable to Trump?
Well, the reporting is a bit vague, but it seems like these could be rare earth minerals, things like lithium, cobalt, manganese stuff, that's essential for high-tech manufacturing, particularly for things like batteries and electronics.
Ah, so this is where Trump's America First agenda comes into play. He wants to reduce U.S. reliance on China for these critical materials, and Ukraine happens to have some decent reserves.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Even if this deal does happen, it raises some ethical and economic concerns for Ukraine. Are they getting a fair price for these resources? What are the environmental impacts of mining them? And most importantly, is this just a short-term fix or part of a larger strategy for economic independence?
It feels like Ukraine is being asked to make some really tough choices with potentially huge consequences down the line. But before we spiral into despair, I want to bring in another key aspect that we haven't touched on yet: public opinion. How are regular people in Ukraine, Europe, and the U.S. viewing all of this? Because at the end of the day, leaders can make all the deals they want, but if the people aren't on board, it's not going to last.
You're absolutely right. Public sentiment can make or break any policy, and this situation is no different. So what are the people thinking? Well, let's start with Ukraine. We already heard from Nick Connolly that there's a sense of surprise and cautious optimism surrounding the strong European reaction. But there's also a deep-seated anxiety about what the future holds.
I can only imagine. They're literally living on the front lines of a conflict that could escalate at any moment.
And they're acutely aware that their fate is being decided by forces beyond their control. There's a sense of frustration with the lack of agency, a feeling that they're being used as pawns in a game they didn't choose to play.
But they're not just passive victims, are they? We talked about Zelensky's defiant stance, and it seems like that resonates with a lot of Ukrainians.
Yes, there's a pride in his willingness to stand up to Trump, to defend their interests, even when facing immense pressure. It's almost like they're saying, we're not going to be bullied, we're not going to back down.
Okay, so we've got Ukrainians feeling a mix of hope and anxiety. What about Europe? How are they viewing all of this?
Well, it's a mixed bag, as you might expect. There's definitely a growing awareness of the stakes involved, a recognition that what happens in Ukraine has implications for the entire continent.
Yeah.
But there's also a degree of fatigue, a sense that they've been dealing with this crisis for years now, and they're not sure how much more they can take.
And I bet the economic anxieties don't help either. Like, sure, we support Ukraine, but how much is it going to cost us?
Exactly. And then you have the whole political dimension. There are some who see this as a defining moment for Europe, a chance to assert their independence from the U.S. and forge their own path. But there are others who are more cautious, who worry about provoking Russia, who still see the U.S. as an essential partner.
So a lot of internal debate happening within Europe, which brings us to the U.S. How are Americans reacting to all of this?
That's where things get really interesting. Because frankly, Ukraine isn't really a top-of-mind issue for most Americans. There's a lot of domestic focus right now, the economy, social issues, political divisions. And when it comes to foreign policy, Ukraine is often seen as a distant problem, something that doesn't directly impact their lives.
But isn't that part of the problem? This idea that we can just ignore what's happening in other parts of the world, that it doesn't affect us? History has shown us time and time again that that's a dangerous way of thinking.
Absolutely. And I think that's where this whole deep dive becomes so crucial. It's about connecting the dots, showing how events in seemingly far-off places can have ripple effects that reach our own shores. whether it's through economic ties, security concerns, or simply the moral imperative to stand up for what's right. What happens in Ukraine matters to all of us.
Okay, so we've explored the complex dynamics between Ukraine, Europe, and the U.S. We've heard from experts, politicians, and even gotten a sense of public opinion. Where do we go from here? What are the potential scenarios that could play out in the coming months and years?
Well, that's what we'll be diving into in part 3 of this episode. We'll examine the possible futures for Ukraine, the role of key players, and the potential implications for the global order.
So buckle up, folks. It's about to get even more interesting. Okay, so we've laid out the landscape, talked about the players. Now the big question, what's next? What does the future hold for Ukraine?
Yeah, it does feel like we're at this crossroads, right? So many potential paths forward, and they all lead to drastically different outcomes.
So let's play that what-if game for a minute. What are some of those paths? Give us the best case and the worst case scenarios.
All right, well, let's start with a bit of optimism, shall we?
Yeah.
Imagine Europe truly steps up their game. I mean, really commits significant military aid, economic aid.
Yeah.
Not just symbolic gestures, but the kind of support that lets Ukraine build up their defenses, seriously deter further Russian aggression.
Okay, so Europe goes all in, but what about the U.S.? Are they just totally out of the picture in this scenario?
Not necessarily. Maybe this whole crisis ends up being a wake-up call for them, forces them to rethink their role in the region. Maybe a new administration comes in, one that's more committed to transatlantic alliances, and they start working with Europe to find a diplomatic solution.
So you're thinking Europe and the U.S., despite all the recent tension, they somehow managed to cooperate, present a united front against Russia. Is that even realistic at this point?
It'd be tough. No doubt about that. There's a lot of baggage, a lot of mistrust to overcome. But I wouldn't rule it out entirely. And if they could pull it off, it would send a powerful message to Putin that his attempts to divide the West haven't worked.
Okay, I like that scenario. But let's be real for a second. There are so much darker possibilities too, right? Things could go south pretty quickly.
That's the unfortunate truth. And the worst case scenario, the one that keeps a lot of folks up at night, is a full-scale Russian invasion. If Putin senses weakness, if he sees Europe divided, the U.S. disengaged, he might just be tempted to make a move.
And what would that look like? Would we be talking like tanks rolling across the border, a massive military offensive? Or something else?
Could be that overt, yeah. Or it could be more insidious. Think cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, covert operations designed to destabilize the Ukrainian government, sow chaos from within.
And in that scenario, would NATO get involved? I mean, would we be looking at World War III?
That's the terrifying question, isn't it? The one no one wants to answer. NATO's committed to defend its members, but Ukraine isn't a member. So it's this huge gray area, and Putin might be willing to test the limits to see how far he can go.
Man, it feels like we're talking about a powder keg here. So many sparks that could set it off. It's overwhelming to even think about.
Yeah.
So given all this uncertainty, what can regular people like us do? It all feels so huge, so out of our control.
I get that. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of these massive global forces, but honestly, I believe even small actions can make a difference.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me some hope here.
First and foremost, stay informed. Don't let Ukraine become just another headline that you scroll past. Keep asking questions, keep seeking out different perspectives, and don't be afraid to challenge the narratives that you're being fed.
Knowledge is power, right? The more we understand what's happening, the better equipped we are to actually make a difference.
Exactly. And never underestimate the power of your voice. Talk to people about this, your friends, your family, your elected officials. Make Ukraine a topic of conversation, raise awareness, push for policies that support peace and stability in the region.
And what about more concrete actions? Are there things we can do beyond just talking?
Absolutely. There are tons of organizations doing amazing work on the ground in Ukraine, providing humanitarian aid, supporting refugees, promoting democracy and human rights. Find one that speaks to you and get involved.
Whether it's donating money, volunteering your time, or just spreading the word. So many ways to make a real tangible difference.
And it's not just about helping the Ukrainians. It's about standing up for the values that we believe in: democracy, freedom, self-determination.
You know, we started this whole deep dive with a question. Can Europe welcome Zelenskyy at Ukraine summit without enraging Trump? And as we've gone deeper into this, I think we've realized that question is way too simple.
Totally. It's so much bigger than just Trump or Europe. This is about a fundamental shift in the global landscape, a reordering of power that could completely reshape the world as we know it.
And Ukraine is at the heart of it all. They're fighting not just for their own survival, but for the future of democracy and freedom in a world that seems to be turning away from those values.
So next time you see a news story about Ukraine, don't just scroll past. Take a moment to think about what's at stake, about the choices being made, about how those choices will echo for generations to come.
Because this isn't some far-off conflict. It's about all of us. It's about the kind of world we want to live in. And the future, well, that's still unwritten. It's up to us to decide what happens next.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope it sparked your curiosity, maybe challenged some assumptions, and hopefully inspired you to take some action.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep diving deep.